So we're pleased to have Deepak Awasti with us today. Deepak, what I would like to do is start out by getting a little background information from you, and then we'll continue with the other question. So to start it off, where were your parents born?
They were born in India.
Okay. And where were you born?
I was also born in India.
Okay, very good. And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, any post-secondary?
I received my elementary, secondary, and post-secondary mainly in Montreal. Some of it in Ottawa and in Toronto.
Okay. And what is your current occupation?
I work as a legal researcher and case analyst in the legal field.
Okay. And where do you live now?
I live in Montreal.
Okay, very good. So now we're going to kind of get to the meat of this whole matter. So these are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today. So to start off with, what in your mind is the best thing about living in Quebec?
I couldn't live anywhere else. I lived in Ottawa, Toronto, Tokyo, and Montreal was always home. As my wife put it to me once, she said, "You're the most unintegrable person I've ever come across." You are truly a Quebecer, if not a Montrealer, and because you stand out either naturally or because of your upbringing. So Montreal is it.
Good enough. Now, a lot of people have a problem with the next question. I certainly, if somebody posed it to me, I'd have difficulty with it. But having said that, I'd like you to answer the question as posed, and then after answering, you can elaborate as much as you like. So having said that, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
It's a love. I'm not sure how to explain it, except to say that it's quizzical. Okay. It's a quizzical relationship, I'd say. It's undescribable. It's enigmatic. It's quizzical. There's a certain whimsy to it. You're not sure how to describe it.
Very good. Now, where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
Well, that is also a difficult question to answer because I feel at home in Montreal. I do feel at home in Quebec in a general way. But do I fit into any particular group? No. I've never really. I mean, I was raised in the Park Extension area in Montreal and in the Anglophone and Protestant communities, but I was never really a part of them. I mean, I've always been a part of Montreal, but never really a part of the English/Protestant communities in the same way as perhaps the Protestant and English communities believe they were, or how do you define an Anglo, or how did you define a Protestant back then? I was just an Anglo or a Protestant for educational and social purposes only. My identity is not exclusively Protestant English or South Asian, Quebecer. I mean, it's a multitude of identities. I feel at home in all of those, and I don't really feel a part of them.
Okay, well, that's interesting because that leads me right into the next question. I'm going to preface the next question a little bit because people often ask me, the second part asks about the official definition of Quebec. They said, well, according to who? And my answer to that, and the way the question is framed and what we're looking for, is the official definition that you perceive. It can be the Quebec government's definition, it can be your peers' definition, the media's definition, Canada's definition. So having said that, I'll ask the two-part question in its entirety. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Well, let's start with the first one.
Mhm.
From a civic standpoint, anyone who lives in Quebec is a Quebecer, regardless of how long that person has been here. I mean, just because you've been here 2 months or 200 years, you know, or at least your family has been here, your ancestors, you're no more or no less a Quebecer, as much as you're no less or no more a Canadian. I mean, that's how I regard Quebecers, or myself as a Quebecer. And historically, I've always, because I mean, I grew up in a time when the English and French communities, or nations, if I can use that term, were the dominant players in the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s. They would always come back at you and say, well, this is not your land, this is ours, because England, or because Canada is a place of two founding nations. Well, we've evolved considerably since the 1990s from a society of two founding nations to a multiplicity of nations. And Quebec, too, despite what many nationalists might characterize it as, and I've been, I mean, if you're aware that I was a candidate for the Liberal Party in Laurier-Dorion, and I was, you know, criticized, or at least attacked, and I didn't really care, but attacked for having said that Quebec is not a nation. Well, it's not that I believe that whether Quebec is a nation or not, and we can discuss that, but it's a question of what constitutes Quebec. Is there one nation that constitutes Quebec, or are there multi or many nations that constitute Quebec? And I would argue that there are many nations that constitute Quebec. The French nation, the English nations, the First Nations, the Innu nation, and all the other nations that have settled in Quebec since the 1700s. You know, the Irish, the Germans, the Acadians, all of them. They're all different nations. And so as a Quebecer, when someone says, well, your experience should be your expression and your experiences should be in the French language and according to the French culture, my answer is no, because that's not my experience. Living in Montreal, yes, my experience was largely English, but it wasn't. At home, it wasn't English. The culture that I lived in was very much South Asian. I couldn't go out and express myself or my South Asian culture in Quebec society because it was considered peripheral or non-existent. But today, Quebec society is changing. It's changing considerably. I mean, I was just looking at stats in the past, the last 3 census reports, and I was looking at population change and population growth, and I was astounded to discover that in the last 10 years, in Quebec, 85% of all population growth is either visible minorities or it's non-Francophones. And the question then becomes, if we're talking about Quebec society being uniformly French, and given the fact that the vast majority of the population growth, and actually it's going to accelerate, is not Francophone or Pure Laine, Souche, whatever you want to call it. When does the Quebec identity stop becoming French as in the historical context? Because if you look at it, if you read the nationalist press, they talk about Quebec as a nation state in the literal sense, in the proper sense of a nation, a predominant nation controlling the state and society. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. The English and the Protestants, you know, when I was a school commissioner many years ago, I kept telling the leaders of the Protestant and Anglophone community, you really have to understand that your community is no longer where you thought it was, or where it might have been in 1960s and 70s. It's gone far beyond that. They didn't understand that. And today the Francophones are going through the same thing. They don't understand that their society is changing and that it's not going to reflect them, their history, their values, their aspirations within 30 to 40 years. Within 30 to 40 years, the Francophone population will be down to about 60%. Now I'm talking mother tongue Francophone. And if you look at that mother tongue Francophone component, maybe only half of that population will be de souche. The rest will in fact be will be immigrants. So what identity are we talking about? And what is the nation at that point? And then of course the question becomes, you know, if you have national aspirations of a Quebec as a nation, how do you convince people who don't share your history and your DNA or your values to stand with you and to walk with you to become an independent nation or to become a French nation? Because what you're going to do is you're going to constantly say to these people, either A, you're not good enough, or B, you're not doing well enough to be part of us or be like us. And that's what they're doing. So my attitude is, you know, Quebec is not what it was. It will never be what it was. And you can't force it back. So either you learn to share, either you realize that change is coming and you learn to share now, or you resist and you're overwhelmed by change. It's up to you. I don't mind.
Well, fair enough. And you've alluded to possible responses to the next question in the previous questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway. A lot of these questions are framed in such a manner as to get to certain points, you know, from a different point of view and a different angle. So having said that, has your identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
I have, again, I didn't realize this when I was perhaps much younger, but I come at Quebec, at my identity as a Quebecer and as a Canadian from a very civic or civil point of view. And I basically say that if we believe that government, or let me rephrase it. I would like to be, I mean, everyone, okay, let me rephrase. Everyone has their individual identity. Everyone wants to see their identity expressed, or they want to express their identity somehow in their own way. That's fine. The state, now in Quebec, it's become very different in the last 40, 50 years, but, and I think it was the case prior to that. Whereas in 1774, as part of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and Quebec Act of 1774, the Crown basically said, we want to allow the people of Quebec, as it existed in 1774, to live according to their values, to be served according to their languages and their legal and cultural traditions, and that government should not interfere in the lives of the people, because government is not there to impose its values upon anyone. It is there to serve, and that is the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And today, we've turned it around, and what we've done is we have attached the interests of one particular nation and attached that to the state and government, and we have imposed that, or we have melded the national interest, the interest of one nation with the interest of state, and said that this is now the public interest. That's not the same. The public interest is far more vast. The public identity is far more vast than just the interest and identity of one particular nation. So I go back to what is my belief of what the Quebec state should be and what my identity should be. First of all, if the state of Quebec wants to be secular, I have no problem with that. It should not require it should not impose the idea of state secularism upon individuals. But on top of that, I do believe that the government should in fact be saying that we cannot hold a particular national identity either, that we cannot be nationalist, because if we are nationalist, then we are acting contrary to the public interest while acting in the interest of one nation. So in my view, my identity as a Quebecer is a very civic or civil identity. And it is contrary to the nationalist identity, or the identity of one predominant nation that establishes or imposes its values in itself upon others. Okay. I believe my views are totally contrary to that.
Okay, fair enough. Now, that leads us into the next question that you may have already answered, but we're going to ask it anyway for the record. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec today?
Well, when the government says that it speaks for all Quebecers, contrary to the Canadian government, when it says that the Canadian government doesn't represent Quebecers, that Canadian values and national, or the values of Canada, are contrary to the values of Quebec, I've got a problem with that. Because that's not what I believe. We are all Quebecers, we are all Canadians, and it shocks me and frustrates me when government starts to say we speak on behalf of all Quebecers, and all Quebecers are thinking contrary to the rest of Canada, which is not true. So what frustrates me also is when nationalists say that in order to be a Quebecer, you must be less Canadian. I don't have to be less Canadian in order to be more Quebec or more Quebecer. And I don't have to be less Quebecer to be more Canadian. So I do believe that when these dichotomies are created, these false dichotomies are created, I think I certainly fight these.
Okay. Now, to drill down a little further, in recent years, members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, I go back to the question of who is being threatened and what is being threatened. Because while nationalists will say that the French language is threatened in the sea of English-speaking North Americans, true or not? Not really. I mean, the fact is Quebec has its jurisdictional authority. It houses power. And within this jurisdiction, the French language is well protected and well used. Outside of this province, the French language, sure. I mean, it's not as if I mean, it's true that the French-speaking population is declining, either because it's an older population and it's not being renewed, or people are moving away from those pockets into bigger towns and cities where the French-speaking population is much smaller. So they're, by virtue of demographic shifts or mobility, greater mobility, those pockets are becoming smaller. And of course, yes, there's a threat. But again, Canadian society is no longer English or French. I go back to the fact that in the rest of Canada, or I think in Canada as a totality, 54% of the population is English speaking or mother tongue Anglophone. And that's declining. Within 20 years, the English population will be the largest minority in Canada. And in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, possibly even Montreal, actually, yeah, possibly even Montreal, the English-French populations will be a minority in these regions. And the other language groups are not, there's not just one language group, there are many language groups. So as Keith Spicer said many years ago, he actually, I think he was quite prescient about this, that by 2020, cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal will be towers of Babel. This is something he said in the late 70s. And it's true. They are towers of Babel. But more and more, other towns and villages, places like Ottawa, Hamilton, Windsor, and other cities, Winnipeg and so on and so forth, are going to become the same towers of Babel. So what exactly is under threat? I mean, today, the French language or the French culture or the French identity might be under threat, although I don't disagree with that to some extent. But the English language and culture and identity are also being threatened by newcomers. But should we now start to say that we are going to establish the same rules and regulations that exist in Quebec, and that we are going to try and protect the primacy and the supremacy of the English language and culture? Why would we do that? I mean, again, I go back to the idea of what is the French language? Is it the exclusive reserve or preserve of the historical French nation? Or is it something that that is shared by everyone, by you, by me, by everyone? And if that's the case, then the language is thriving. But if the French community says, no, it's ours, and we are giving it to you, and you are there to keep it going, and you are there to pay homage to us and to our history, I'm not going to do that. Because I mean, I've said this very bluntly. I do find that there are nationalists out there who are very hypocritical, who argue for protection of official languages and official languages nations and official languages cultures at the expense of the greater public good. Because I'm not talking about protecting the two founding nations thesis anymore. I'm not here to protect the two founding nations. I'm not here to protect their primacy. I'm not here to protect our national identity as an English and French society. I am here to live, and I'm living in 7 languages. My identity is South Asian, it's English, it's French, it's a variety of things. And I express myself and I express my identity in a variety of ways. It doesn't affect my personal identity. So, but the Francophone community believes that, and it's strange, they're not sure which way to go. On the one hand, they want people to integrate or to assimilate into their nation, but they're afraid that those people who come into their nation will not be loyal to them and to their nation, and will change them. So they're not sure whether to allow them in or to keep them out. And we're not sure which way to go. So there's an ambiguity. There's a sense of, what do you want from us? Do you want us in? Do you want us out? And that's something that I think all Montrealers would share, is that we don't, I mean, we as Montrealers, we don't impose upon anyone. We welcome everyone. Come to our home and we'll work, we'll live together, we'll thrive happily. We're not going to say you have to speak our language or act according to our culture. We don't do that. We're very happy living together, working together for a better society. That's all, I mean, if we want to go back to the Trudeau idea of a more just society is not just an English society or French society, it is a civil society.
Well, that brings us to the next question, which kind of sums up what you've been talking about. What is the biggest problem facing Quebec today, and how, in your mind, do you feel it could be resolved?
The biggest threat or concerns to Quebec society is the debates we're always having over our identity and the relationship between Quebec and the rest of Canada, between the French nation and other nations of Quebec, and the future of the French nation and the future of Quebec, the future of the French nation within Quebec and the future of Quebec within Canada. But we've never talked about, and I raised this point with several of my colleagues in the Liberal Party, we talk about the role, and the Liberal Party has always talked about the role of Quebec within Canada, but we've never asked the question, what is the role of Canada within Quebec? How do we live as Canadians? If we ask the question of how do we live, what are we as Quebecers, how do we live and what are we as Canadians? And Quebec, because the French nation feels so threatened, the dilemma, the debate that exists will always be there, because it can't get over its fears, its anxieties, its frustrations, because it hasn't, the French nation still hasn't learned how to live with other people, because it's so fearful of other people and how they will change it. That's why they keep asking, you people want to bring in 500,000 people annually. How are you going to protect us? How are you going to make sure that we aren't overwhelmed or drowned in the sea of foreigners. You know, how you want to, I mean, they now say, and they don't like it when I say this, but before I tell you about that, but they talk about all these people, they want to now to have exclusive control over immigration and to ensure that only Francophones emigrate or come to Quebec. Of course, the problem is that the vast majority of people who are French-speaking who come to Quebec are from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They're not European. Maybe only out of the 20,000 or so that are coming to Quebec that are French-speaking, only about 6,000 or 7,000 are from Europe. Maybe 8,000 are Europe. That's young. That are French-speaking. 30% of immigrants who come here are Europeans. The rest are non-Europeans. So if the French nation is afraid of losing its European identity, if it's afraid of losing its Judeo-Christian values, if it's afraid of losing its DNA, its classical or historical DNA, it can't help but say we want only people from Europe. And if it wants to protect its French-speaking portion, then it can't help but say we want only French-speaking Europeans. Further to that, and this is where it comes down to, for several years, nationalists have been talking about the idea that they want to control Quebec to such an extent that they would be able to determine whether a person from the rest of Canada could come into Quebec. They're already doing it a little bit with Bill 96 by controlling who can come here for the purposes of education. But what we're leading towards is essentially Quebec becoming the Kashmir of Canada. And what I mean by that, in the context of Kashmir, Kashmir was, until about 2 or 3 years ago, an autonomous region. And this was constitutionally established. There was an article, Article 370, it gave Kashmir full autonomy and full control over its jurisdiction. And the only people who could live there were, in fact, ethnic Kashmiris. No one else could invest, no one else could live in that area. And many people left because of that. Well, that's what essentially we seem to be moving towards. The ethnicization or the creation of a homeland for the French nation within Canada. Or in other words, for Kashmiris in Quebec. And I don't want to go there, but we are going there. And we're going there by this has been happening since let's say, certainly the mid 80s, with the idea of distinct society, with the idea of cooperative federalism, with the idea of autonomy. It's all leading us slowly but surely toward a nation state. And when I use the term nation state, I mean a state where one particular nation is dominant and it is the exclusive control of that nation. We are moving towards a nation state, a French nation state within Quebec, within Canada, and that would be Quebec.
Now, the next question, before I ask you the next question, I want to ask you a separate question that has nothing to do with this. Have you had by any chance an opportunity to see the great documentary by Guy Rogers called What We Choose to Remember?
No.
Okay, Guy Rogers, the filmmaker, a good friend of mine, made this incredible documentary. I've shared it with many people. He's in fact going around the province now, introducing it and playing it at various forums, civic centers and church basements and that sort of thing. However, There is a link to a website that does play it. You can watch if your TV is hooked up to the internet. You can watch it on your TV or your laptop, your iPad, whatever. And what I will do for your benefit, because I strongly urge you to see it, I will send you the link to that. And it's called What We Choose to Remember, Quebec Through Waves of Immigration.
Mhm.
It really talks about some of the things you've touched upon here. That's why I bring it up. So I will provide you with that. The other reason I
Thanks.
bring it up, because within that documentary, he uses a great visual tool, which I'm about to use in the next question.
Okay.
Could you indicate to me by a show of fingers on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weak, 10 being strong, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges? Excellent. Very good.
I will die here.
Very good. Okay, this wraps it up. I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to anything else that you'd like to say about identity or belonging in Quebec.
Well, I simply want to say that I do belong to Quebec. I do belong in Quebec. And I'm not saying that as a some sort of aggressive statement. I'm not. It's not a prideful nationalistic comment, but there's a love and joy that I have living in Quebec and in Montreal, in particular. I often say that Toronto has all the money but no culture, and Montreal has no money but all the culture. And that is essentially who we are. We are such a bohemian and happy people that we really, we just want to live with one another and be happy sharing with people our joy about being Montrealers. And it's a wonderful place. We're very happy living together and sharing and working together to build a more just society. And I want to be able to do that for the subsequent generations and for all Quebecers. So that's a summary of it.
Well, Deepak, listen, thank you very much for participating. I'm going to shut off the recording. We can continue this conversation because I can't really comment on what you've covered as part of this project. So I'll stop the recording.